Today. Firstly, I would like to introduce Brandon Maddox, who is going to be providing an ASL interpretation today for the deaf and hard of hearing community. So some of us might be talking a little slower at points just to make sure that he can pass across our message. So first, I'd like to introduce Jennifer, who is going to share a part of the story and really set the tone for the rest of the event today.
Thank you, Louise. Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer Uchendu. I'm from Nigeria. I'm Nigerian, and I'm a youth climate activist. Today, we're here to talk about eco-anxiety, and which is really important, something and a term that I have been experiencing for quite a while now, that I wasn't able to name until the term became sort of really popular. And for me, eco-anxiety really goes beyond the shame and the guilt that most people from the global south feel, from the global north rather. But for me, it was really about the anger and the grief and the fear and the worry and thinking about my future as a Nigerian woman and the impacts of climate change for people like me, my family, people in my village, people in the Niger Delta. And I guess the powerlessness and the overwhelm that comes with eco-anxiety is really crippling. It's a real thing, and it's something that young people like myself have to grapple with, have to think of. How do we manage the situation? What can we do? And what spaces exist to sort of circumvent this feeling? Today, we'll talk about my personal story and particularly findings from the publication. And you will see that this is something that is really affecting young people all over the world in different ways, based on how the climate crisis impacts us. This is a real problem. It's a public health problem. It's a mental health problem. And it's a climate change problem. Really, there's no way we're going to address the climate crisis without really looking at how young people are feeling about the challenges around us. Thank you, Louisa.
Thank you, Jennifer. So welcome again to everyone here today. If you have any questions throughout the event, please direct them into the Q&A section at the bottom, and we will answer those questions the best we can later in the event. Introduction of who we are the Eco-Anxiety and Climate Emotions Research Group. We're an international research group, and it is a collaboration between clinical psychologists, environmental psychologists, psychiatrists, psychotherapists, and ecologists, all working together to try and understand how the eco-anxiety can affect our emotions. And what we did here today, or what we're presenting today, is a study which the survey element was funded by Avaz and explored the thoughts and feelings that young people and children had towards climate change, as well as their views on how the government's responding to it and the different ways they interact with each other. So now I'm going to move on to Liz, who is going to explain the study in a lot more detail and share some of our findings with you.
Thank you, Eloise. We would like to share with you the voices of 10,000 children and young people from across the world, aged 16 to 25, 1,000 people from these 10 diverse countries completed an online survey this May. Developed by the International Eco-Anxiety and Climate Emotions Research Group, our findings will be published by Lancet Planetary Health. And they showed that climate anxiety and distressing eco-emotions in children and young people are widespread, and this affects their functioning. Climate anxiety isn't a mental illness. It's a rational response to the psychological stress and realities of climate change. And if unabated, such chronic stress will probably affect their mental health. These eco-emotions were associated with heartbreaking thoughts and beliefs, but are often dismissed and ignored by others. Many believe that governments are failing them due to inaction on climate change. They feel betrayed, and feeling betrayed is linked to their distress. So I'll go through each of these findings in turn. As you can see here, when we asked how worried children and young people feel about climate change threatening people and planet, 8 out of 10 of our sample are worried, with almost 6 out of 10 being very or extremely worried. And you can see also that nearly half told us that this affects their normal daily life, things like eating, sleeping, going to school, play. We then looked at worry and functioning across each of the different countries that we surveyed. And as you can see, there is some variation between countries. The levels were high across the board, and particularly high in those countries that may already be more affected by the direct effects of climate change. We asked our sample how climate change makes them feel. And as you can see on this next slide, 2/3 feel sad and afraid. Over half feel anxious, angry, powerless, helpless, guilty. Over 4 in 10 told us that they feel ashamed, despair, grief, hurt, and depressed. Less than 1/3 felt optimistic or indifferent. These young people told us that they had these devastating thoughts about climate change too. Over half think that they won't have access to the same opportunities that their parents had. Over half think that their family's security will be threatened. Over half think that the things that they most value will be destroyed. 8 out of 10 think that people have failed to take care of the planet. 3/4 think that the future is frightening. 4 out of 10 are hesitant to have their own children because of climate change. And over half of our sample told us that they think humanity is doomed. So when we ask children and young people how they think about a future of climate change, they describe a world full of lost opportunities. It's frightening and insecure. There is loss. They feel a sense of doom to the extent that it affects their own right to have their own family. And yet, despite such powerful thoughts and feelings of those children and young people who have tried to talk about climate change to other people, nearly half have been dismissed or ignored. And this isn't just on a personal level. For the first time at this large scale, we asked these children and young people how they think governments are responding to climate change. 6 out of 10 told us that they think that governments are failing young people, that governments are lying about the effectiveness of the actions that they're taking, that governments are dismissing people's distress, that governments are betraying them and future generations. Only 1/3 think that governments are acting according to science or protecting them and future generations. Less than 1/3 think that governments can be trusted, that they are doing enough to prevent a climate catastrophe, or that they are taking their concerns seriously. When asked about how government responses to climate change makes them feel, many described a sense of betrayal. They're feeling anguished, abandoned, afraid, angry, ashamed, belittled. We also found some hope. Young people told us they can feel reassured when governments act, as well as protected, valued, hopeful. However, these feelings of reassurance were significantly lower than the feelings of betrayal in every single country that we surveyed. Feelings of betrayal in these children and young people were correlated with more worry, more negative thoughts about climate change, and negative impact on daily functioning. This suggests a link between government inaction on climate change and children and young people's distress. Let's just take a moment to reflect on those findings and what they mean.
Thank you for that, Liz. Okay, so now we're going to pass on to Caroline, who's going to talk a bit more about the deeper context and kind of the implications of what the study means. So I'll pass it to you, Caroline.
Thank you, Louise, thank you, Liz. And just to clarify, I may use some examples from my qualitative research from the University of Bath to help illustrate some of the points that I'm making. And these are not quotes from children direct from this research, but it's an attempt to illustrate. So I've been talking with people all morning, adults all morning, about this research and these findings. And they've been saying to me, isn't this depressing? Isn't this bleak? And I've been saying, well, you could hear it that way. And yes, it is, you're absolutely right. But it's also an opportunity for us to validate the feelings and the thoughts of children and young people. It's also an opportunity for us to say sorry to the children and young people who are feeling dismissed, betrayed, abandoned, and not listened to. You could think of this as hopeless, helpless. Or you could take the opportunity to think of this as an opportunity for courage, for imagination, and to listen to children's distress, to take it seriously. You could hear blame of governments in this research, or you could hear us calling governments towards accountability, to pay attention to culpability, to uphold children's rights, and the duty of care to children. You could hear that children are over anxious, they're worrying, they're overthinking. Or you could hear that children have the courage to speak out, and given the opportunity to tell us how they feel and what they think, they want to be heard. You could say, well, children are always worrying about something, aren't they? Well, you could say that actually their anxiety is understandable because they're listening to what scientists are saying. You could say it's just children. Well, or you could say, actually, this is all of us. And actually, I think we are all feeling this too. We knew when we started this research that many children and young people were anxious and afraid. We knew that, but we didn't know how scared they were. A child from my research said to me, I'm scared to breathe the air outside my house. I'm scared of the weather. Do you know what that's like? When we started this research, we knew that children's lives were being affected on a daily basis, but we didn't know how much. We didn't know how much this was affecting eating, sleeping, studying, and playing. Charles said to me, from my research, we saw online that people had a funeral for a glacier in Iceland. This is a child in the Maldives. He said to me, who's going to have a funeral for us? We're going to be underwater soon. When we started this research, we knew it was affecting children's thinking, their cognition, but we didn't really know what that meant. 4 out of 10 hesitant to have children. Over half of children think humanity is doomed. A child in the Maldives said to me, he said, climate change is like Thanos in the Avengers Endgame, whose ideology is to kill off half the planet so the other half can thrive. And then he said, but the trouble is we're the half being killed off. What we did not know when we started this research was how this correlated with beliefs about government action or inaction on climate change. with 2/3 of children believing that governments are lying, failing and betraying them and future generations. A teenager in the UK said to me, why should I want to live in a world that doesn't care? This world that doesn't care about children and animals. Tell me why. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Caroline. And I think that does really sets the tone of what we're talking about today, that these children are feeling intense emotions about something which we believe that governments and those in positions of power have a strong responsibility to deal with. And 6 years ago, we had the Paris Agreement, which had such great goals to begin with and was a moment of hope for a lot of people. But now 6 years later, approaching COP26, our research shows that young people in many of these countries are still feeling betrayed and they feel that governments aren't doing enough. So now I'm going to introduce Natasha, who is a human rights expert and is going to shine a more legal lens on our findings and the implications they have.
Thank you so much, Louise. And after those incredibly emotional testimonies that we've heard, I want to start with a list, maybe a drier list as a lawyer here, but it's a list of emotions: intense mental suffering, feelings of fear, anguish, powerlessness, hopelessness, or inferiority, capable of breaking somebody's moral and physical resistance, constant mental anxiety, prolonged uncertainty, desperation. These are words that we can use to describe what, unfortunately, all too many young children and young people are experiencing in the face of climate catastrophe, as the study that's being launched today demonstrates so starkly. These are also the words that the European Court of Human Rights has used to describe the feelings that it associates with inhuman and degrading treatment. Why is this significant? If climate anxiety, particularly among children and young adults, falls within the scope of the absolute right not to be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, then it gives rise to non-negotiable obligations on states to act to alleviate this phenomenon of climate anxiety and, of course, its causes. And this is a live issue in a case that's currently at the European Court of Human Rights, the case of Agostinho and others against Portugal and others, which is being brought by 6 children and young adults against 33 states, arguing that these states' actions and inactions in respect of climate change violate human rights. The European Court of Human Rights has, of its own motion, so independently of the arguments of the parties, raised the question of whether Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which guarantees the right not to be subjected to torture or to inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, has been violated. And all the states that are responding to this claim are obliged to address this question. But are children and young people who are experiencing climate anxiety being ill-treated? The study that is being launched today demonstrates that the serious distress that so many children and young people experience in relation to the climate crisis stems from the failure, or rather the refusal, of those in power to take their concerns seriously and to undertake the immediate and drastic action that's needed to protect them. And the European Court of Human Rights has established in its case law that an attitude of indifference or disregard by state authorities through their policies and practices towards a powerless person's serious suffering that the authorities are aware of and in a position to alleviate can amount to ill treatment. And this is what we're looking at here: the betrayal and systematic disregard that children and young adults perceive, according to the study, is rationally grounded in report upon report that finds that states are not acting appropriately enough or fast enough to avert the crossing of irreversible tipping points, exposing them to potentially irreparable harm. The wrongfulness, the culpability that Caroline spoke about of states' inaction, in particular in the face of youth's well-founded anxiety and distress, is deepened by the pronounced vulnerability of children that is recognized by the European Court of Human Rights and by other human rights actors, and by the fact that rather than acting in the best interest of the child, as is their duty, states' inactions are condemning the younger generations to bear the brunt of climate change. The study presented today captures the psychological implications, I think, of this intergenerational injustice. And it really strengthens the case for finding a violation of the right not to be ill-treated in the Agostinho case that's currently at the European Court of Human Rights. A finding that would place considerable additional pressure on states to act urgently to avert the climate catastrophe that so many children and young adults are anxious about. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha, for that, all that information. That's been incredibly useful. And I think, well, firstly, I want to just remind the audience that you can ask any questions if you want more detail about the human rights angle from Natasha or more from the study from Liz or Caroline. Please add them to the Q&A section. And as we go on now, I want to remind the audience that whilst the study is on young people and is on their feelings, they are not passive victims in this conversation. And they are taking many of these matters into their own hands because often they feel like others and those in more traditional seats of power aren't doing enough. And so at this point, I'd like to introduce Louise, who is a German climate activist, to talk about her feelings and her actions as well when dealing with the climate crisis.
Thank you so much for having me. My internet connection is a bit weak, so I hope I am being understood. First of all, I would like to point out that the study very much shows and underlines that while adults mostly keep ignoring the climate crisis, children and youth are very much realizing the mess we are in. Governments are failing us young generations everywhere, and we are not being fooled. This is one of the messages of the study. And while most media outlets don't report as much as needed, while no government is acting as drastically as needed, children and young people are oftentimes told to not worry, but they're not being fooled here. And they're very much looking the crisis into the eye, while most adults still don't. That's the one important thing about the study in my understanding. I think another very important aspect is here that we are seeing is that young people are very much questioning if they could even become children anymore. That tells a tragic story about humanity. A tragic moment of humanity. I am often being asked by younger people after strikes, after readings I do, how I feel about this, if I would still, get children and so on. And just the question, that very simple question, is hugely dramatic. And I don't think the English language has yet words for that to describe how quite dramatic that is. This study shouldn't be a moment for pity. It shouldn't be another excuse for adults to look down at children, pat them on their shoulders and tell them to not worry, but go and play. The adequate answer to the study would be drastic climate actions. The climate crisis itself is a burden we can handle. What we cannot handle is the continuous inaction of governments everywhere. It is unacceptable and it's impossible to carry, knowing that our future is at stake, that our presence is at stake, and that we young generation are facing a future where we will spend every single living year within an escalating climate crisis with no government acting adequately. And that is not acceptable. And so I'm hugely grateful to be part of a movement where people everywhere turn their anxiety into action, where young people are allowing this anxiety to lead them, to motivate them, to bring them together and not separate them. And this is why we're doing everything we can. This is why we're calling for next global climate strike, the 8th global climate strike, the upcoming Friday. This is why we are suing our governments. We successfully sued the German governments, and there are dozens of other court cases out there. We are not being fooled. We are not afraid to acknowledge the crisis we are in, but we are not ready to give up at all. And we need governments to start acting up here. That is the time now.
Thank you for that very powerful message, Louisa. And I agree, as someone within the age bracket of the study, I resonate with a lot of the answers to the survey myself. I'm 23 and I do find the future frightening. I do feel like the future and all my years to come are uncertain, and I want to have a world to grow old and safely, like so many people my generation. And it's so hard to see that far ahead with the escalating situation that we have now. And in a moment, we're going to go to a Q&A section. So if there are any questions, there is an opportunity later to ask some, but this is the first round, particularly any on the study or any to Louise or Jennifer, who's already spoken as well. That would be great. I think, so we have a few questions that have come through, and there is one that I'm going to direct to Caroline and Liz. It's from Oscar Belporto, I believe, and it asked, I understand researchers interview people between 16 and 24 years old. Should we be talking about how children are feeling or only young people? Either one may take that answer.
Well, I'll start, and Liz, you can follow on. We didn't interview the children and young people, just to clarify. This was data collected through a poll. Any reference I make to interviews is from qualitative research. I think what we really wanted to explore here was the younger age group and see how younger children were feeling. And there's a lot of research being done in mid-adults, late teenagers. But for us, we wanted to really talk to the youngest age group that we could do through this means. To quote a child, he said, Caroline, he said, you grew up thinking polar bears would be there forever. He said, I've grown up knowing that they would go extinct. So we were really wanting to examine what it meant for children and young people to grow up through this emotional and cognitive lens. Liz, do you want to add something?
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. Yeah, I would echo that. And in doing an online survey like this, where we were asking these types of questions, we felt it would be most ethical to ask questions of children aged 16, 17, 18, and young people up to the age of 25. And so I think we do need to be talking, exactly as Caroline said, children younger than that feel like this too. This global survey focused on 16 to 25-year-olds.
Great, thank you for those answers. And we have one from Jessit Ananu. I'm sorry if I said your name wrong. A journalist from the Philippines, and has two questions. First, I'd like to ask how well represented are countries in the global south in your study. Many young people in these countries may have limited or no access to the internet and thus cannot participate in the study. Second, do you think that there is also a need to change reporting of climate change in media to also highlight the solutions of hope? So I'd like to direct, again, the first question to either Liz or Caroline, but the second one, I would like Jennifer or Louise to talk about the media and how that kind of climate change and that crisis is represented in the media. So I'll come to you secondly.
Yeah, I'll take the one about the representativeness. It's a really good question. So we were able to interview 1,000 people from each country, and to have that kind of global reach, we relied on online survey, an online survey, which certainly means that people who can't have access to IT or the internet would probably not have been able to take part. The survey company that we use, however, does try very hard to get as representative a sample from within each country. And I think the other thing to recognise is we've reported the averages across all of these 10 countries. And if you were to look at each country individually, which will be in our published paper, you'll see there is some variation. But actually, a country such as the Philippines and countries that are probably facing direct effects of climate change already do seem to be reporting higher levels of distress, higher levels of negative beliefs, and across the board, really. So in terms of representativeness of a global population, we can't show that, but we can show a degree of representativeness within each country that we surveyed.
Great, and then to either Jennifer or Louisa, how do you think the media and their sort of portrayal of climate change could really affect the story? Jennifer, didn't go first? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Happy to go first. Well, I mean, definitely a good point where you see this idea of doom and gloom, put out in the media. And I think it's really important for young people, you turn on the news, you go on the internet, you see a crisis or a disaster, but not so much on whatever is being done by young people organizing, through climate activism or through the youth strike. Not so much of that is also being highlighted. However, it's important to tell the full story, to tell the problem. Working in this space, working with young people, we want to know the truth. We want to know what's happening, how bad and the extent of the problem. We don't want to be lied to, but at the same time, it's important to social solutions. What are communities doing to adapt to the climate crisis? We need to show those local solutions because it helps us. It helps in terms of hope. It inspires us to take action one way or the other. And then just knowing that there could just be a chance for us to learn to adapt, to find ways to live with the climate crisis. That is where the media can come in terms of showing that balanced picture. And it would be good for Louisa to also add her thoughts. Thank you.
Yes, maybe just to add, I think we can acknowledge that mainstream media has so far failed in this climate crisis, failed to live up to it, failed to cover it adequately, failed to raise awareness amongst the public, but also challenge politicians on their climate policy. That's where we're at. And I mean, just to illustrate that, we are publicly talking about the climate crisis for 40 years now. And that's about the time span that the internet has been, out there and available. So imagine every single internet outlet, every single digital platform, everything that is happening on media digitally has been developed in this past 40 years. And where we look, when we look at what has been developing in the past 40 years in terms of climate journalism, it's an incredible story. It's a story of failure, actually. And we do see, of course, that single outlets start to take the climate crisis more seriously. But in fact, the large, the huge amount of disinformation that is out there about the climate crisis, the huge amount, the huge parts of society that are still completely unaware of what is going on, that is also, due to media not considering the climate crisis to be the defining issue of the century, but consider this to be a side topic that you can talk about when there's really nothing else to discuss. And this, this of course needs to change. And this, the continuous failure of most media outlets to actually cover the climate crisis in the extent and quality that is needed, that is also allowing governments to fail everywhere. Governments are not being held accountable by media, and we know what important role media play when it comes to holding governments accountable. So in relation to the study, I think we're always also seeing that thankfully young people are not not only absorbing information from mainstream media, because they certainly wouldn't be as aware about the climate crisis as they obviously are. And the question really is, how can media and how quickly can media change that, change the perception that a climate crisis is not one topic amongst many, but the defining state of the planet for the upcoming century, and the number one issue on every single inequality we're seeing worldwide. And that, of course, needs to change drastically. And of course, Jennifer made a really important point about also telling the stories of change. That is, of course, what the study shows as well, that just reporting about the climate crisis is just half of the truth. The other part of the truth is people rising up everywhere, taking their future into their own hands and realizing that it is in our own hands. Everything is possible. 1.5 degrees possible and 4 degrees possible. And we have a decision to make. The climate crisis forces every single one of us to make a decision here. Where do we stand?
Thank you so much, Louisa. So now we're going to have a pause in the questions. There is more opportunity to ask questions later. But now we're going to shift the panel away from the study and more to the young people that it's actually talking about. The strength of the study, that is a quantitative study and it has vast range, but the stories and the opinions of individuals and the young people should also be really considered, that these are people, not just numbers, and their emotions are strong and intense. And again, like I say myself, I am part of this demographic, and I would like to make clear that whilst many of us feel eco-anxiety, it's not something that I'm ashamed of. I feel like that's quite important to note, because eco-anxiety is, the reason I have eco-anxiety is because I have empathy and I care for people on the other side of the planet that I don't know. I have hope for a future that's better than now. I've not given up yet. I have a sense of rage and justice, which makes me want to protect people other than myself. And all of these things are part of my eco-anxiety. So again, even though young people are feeling it, it's not something we're ashamed of, but it's something that we are aware is an added stressor into our lives and can have repercussions and can get progressively worse, especially when we're faced with governments who do not care for us and aren't recognizing that we are the greatest stakeholders in any future decisions they make. So now I'm going to let Jennifer talk more about her position and her story as well, her feelings of eco-anxiety, and yes, take it away.
Thank you very much, Louise. I mean, it's very spot on when you talk on your experience of eco-anxiety and, you know, putting it side by side with my own experience. I run an organization back home in Nigeria, working with young people, children and young people who are really inspired to make change about the environment, wanting to take action on climate change, environmental pollution and biodiversity loss. And what I'm realizing every day is, as much as we try to make change, I also see on the other hand, government inaction, trees being cut up on a daily, you know, with government backing. And it's really infuriating. It's the anger for me and the grief that comes in where you see we're planting trees, you know, we're doing all of these really nice things. And then there's government-backed tree felling, there's government-backed deforestation, and women are suffering in northern Nigeria. Young people are having to suffer the brunt of these issues when the crisis or disasters come in. And you don't often see the media show the two sides of the story, yeah, where you have young people planting trees and then trees being felled on the other hand. And I think it's that anger for me in terms of eco-anxiety. A very, very quick example for me would be my first appearance at COP25 in Madrid, massive media presence, lots of governments and everyone coming to talk about the climate crisis. And there and then, I just suddenly saw the indifference and the neglect government felt towards this problem. It didn't look like we had a crisis at Madrid. There wasn't a sense of urgency. And, you know, that word being betrayed suddenly really fell on me. I felt very betrayed because I'm like, this is a serious problem. This is where all hands need to be on deck for us to talk about solutions. And we're just going about business as usual. Negotiations don't come with that sense of urgency. And activists were even shut out from, you know, the buildings at some point. I remember being, you know, one of the activists going out, you know, to talk about climate justice. And at some point, I lost access to get into the building because I was an activist. Now, this is the problem. This is the infuriating part of eco-anxiety. This is what makes you really powerless and angry, because where you have the top leaders, the top government leaders not prioritizing this problem, coming back to tell communities we're on it, it feels like a massive slap on the face. And for me, thinking about my future, what kind of world would my child live in? Where would my children live in? And what do I have to consider, you know, to live a normal life in the face of eco-anxiety? So while it inspires action on one hand, there's really that sense of powerlessness and overwhelm that comes in faces. And, you know, we say action is a good way to overcome it, but we have to face the reality and we have to make space for conversations like this. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer, especially for sharing your experience at COP. I myself, I'm hoping to go this year, and it's odd because we want to get youth involved, but sometimes, yes, we're sort of secondary or pushed aside or not considered quite as strongly as I think we should be, considering how important these decisions that they make in that space affect us personally and directly and for a long time to come. Passing to you, Louisa, could you talk more about your own organising experience and how being an activist with eco-anxiety has sort of affected you?
Yes, of course. I am 25 and I never planned to become a climate activist, simply because I thought I live in one of the richest countries in the world, in a huge democracy, and I thought there was a government that would take care, and that was what I was raised to believe, that there would be a democratic government that would feel in charge and that would rise up to the occasion once the climate crisis would get too bad. And I found out actually at a COP 2 years prior to the COP in Madrid, in Poland, in Katowice, I found out how much our government is failing us, that there's not a single plan in place to reduce emissions in the time needed to get to real zero in time. And that was 3 years after the Paris Agreement was signed. And so looking around, seeing how everyone was failing us, I felt someone had to do something, and I am someone. So together with many others, we started Fridays for Future in Germany. And for us in such a privileged part of the world, it is an odd feeling knowing that we are one of the biggest polluters worldwide. We cause so much suffering worldwide. No country digs more or burns more brown coal than Germany. If you look at the cumulated emissions historically, there are very few countries who are that much responsible for the climate crisis we're in as Germany is. And we're seeing how our brothers and sisters worldwide are suffering the consequences, are experiencing the climate crisis on a daily basis. And we are seeing how our government is looking away, and how it's not just betraying us and our future, but it's how our own government is betraying the presence of those we are fighting hand in hand with across the globe. And that is a very difficult feeling and a very difficult experience to carry, actually. What do you do if you don't feel betrayed for yourself, but betrayed for everyone you want to fight in solidarity with, when you know that us fighting in Germany, getting our government to do something, getting the industries to divest, leaving that coal in the ground is not only what is needed to protect our future, but to make sure that others still can have a present in safety and dignity. And we are in Germany, we are right before the general election coming up, and it's devastating to see that in the year 2021, with all the climate science on the table, with 3 years of continuous and ongoing climate strikes, there's not a single party that has a plan that would be aligned with our 1.5 degree target. No single party has a plan. And still everyone needs to go vote, and still everyone is in charge. Yet what do you do if you strike for 3 years and we brought 1.5 million people on the street one day and still no plan in sight? So this doesn't leave children and youth untouched. That does something to us, that does something to the way we look at our governments, that does something to the trust we have in our governments, and that does something in our way we look at societies and the lack of willingness or political willingness to protect our futures and the presence of people everywhere. And I'm hugely worried, actually, that the ongoing climate ignorance we're seeing from governments worldwide, and some of the richest governments in the world, will lead more and more young people to turn away from politics and to start losing complete trust in the government's willingness to change anything. And so, we are not just urging governments and our government to act, but we are also urging governments to restore our belief in democracy and democracies and political will to stop talking and start acting.
Thank you to both of you. So now we're going to move on to another Q&A section. Any questions, because we probably won't get through them all, can be directed to this email address, which is media@avaaz.org, Avaaz spelled AVAAZ.org, and we'll try to get to all of them at some point if we can't get through them today. These questions are going to be a bit more on the kind of climate activism, eco-anxiety side of the spectrum, or the kind of interactions between young people and all generations. And the first question I'd like to ask is, where are they? Someone asked, so this is for Jennifer, a viewer on YouTube has asked, as I'm from the Global South, how can I communicate to the youth there? Knowing that they probably don't have the same levels of connectivity, perhaps, that maybe Northern or Global North countries might have.
Could you say that again?
So someone from YouTube asked, I'm guessing they're from the Global South, said, as I'm from the Global South, how can I communicate to the youth here? What resources can I have or utilize to connect more to the Global South?
Awesome, that's a good question. So, I mean, at the moment, there are several sort of local networks for young people who are readily involved with climate change and climate action. A very good place to start from would be to look at the national youth space. For most African countries and in the Global South, there's already a conversation. Young people are already organizing for climate action one way or the other. A second way is through schools. We've seen that, some way we know that the climate crisis is here. A lot of African organizations are now going to schools for advocacy. So I've done that personally, going to engage with young people to talk about the climate crisis. So a good low-hanging place is to work with schools, work with teachers. And then finally, social media can be really helpful. So since you're already from the Global South, use your network within social media and engage with people and have conversations using simple language, just making it very relatable with the problems we see around us. You will definitely get responses because young people are really, really interested in this issue. I hope that helps. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So the next question is going to be, and I might, actually, this could be for Louisa. You as an activist yourself, sometimes you may find that your eco-anxiety might come overwhelming, it might come too much, and someone is asking, how can we come and help children beyond just activism? What other things can we kind of do to be in such a volatile space at the moment?
Well, we need action, and we need people to understand that the climate crisis is not a young people's thing, and it's not an issue of young people, but it's a humanities issue. And this includes everyone, every generation. And I think for someone once said, for children to worry less, adults need to worry more. And I think that is what is needed very much. Adults jumping in, understanding that it's their crisis and it's their job and their responsibility right now to fight this together with us.
Great, thank you. So I'm just going to pause on the questions again now. There is another opportunity a little bit later, but I want to turn to Caroline to talk potentially more about the different emotions and interplays. And Caroline has many, many years of experience talking and giving interviews with young people and sharing their stories and understanding their feelings. And I think it's a very valuable perspective to have that sort of intergenerational lens that Caroline has working with so many young people. And also understanding perhaps how their own parents and children sort of have difficulty sometimes navigating a space. Often parents want to comfort and want to protect their children. And some ways can be more helpful than others with dealing with something like eco-anxiety, which is such an existential worry. So, Caroline.
Thank you. Eloise and I have been working together a while, giving talks together, haven't we? And something Eloise said in one of our talks last year stayed with me really powerfully. You said that you sometimes felt worried about people thinking you were over-emotional when you were talking about how you felt, particularly when it came to eco-anxiety, yeah? And you said something along the lines of, you sort of almost kind of shut down your feelings to make them more hearable by others. And also, I'm adding this, you didn't say this, also, I think to try and avoid being criticized, attacked, put down, patronized, pathologized. Because sometimes when we're talking about these feelings, and we're talking about them particularly with children and young people, verbalizing this and expressing these powerful emotions, it can trigger quite a lot of complex responses in adults. And we can feel guilty, we can feel ashamed, and sometimes we can really struggle to hear what children and young people are saying, or we hear the words and we struggle to really cope with how that can make us feel, because we can feel very guilty. Because there is a reality here that we have greater responsibility. But the problem is, this is tricky, isn't it? Because that can sound very patronizing. And what we're hearing from the young people here on this call today is that they don't perceive themselves as victims. And for us as a group of researchers, psychologists, psychotherapists, that is the last thing we would want to communicate here either. But what's difficult for us is we need to communicate and convey the depth and the severity and the significance of children and young people's suffering. That is extremely real. And it is on a scale and at a depth which is greater than we anticipated. So this is what we need to be able to do, is really communicate and understand that suffering. But at the same time, not turn children and young people into helpless victims, because they're absolutely not. So really, we're talking about things like resilience and courage and imagination and speaking out. But what's really important within that is that we do this together. We really need to understand that eco-anxiety in children and young people can be a slightly different experience to how it can be felt in older generations. And I really apologize. I know I'm generalizing horribly. So, you can hate me later. It's absolutely fine. I hate myself. It's fine. But when young people and children are talking about eco-anxiety, they are absolutely not just talking about environmental destruction, degradation. They're also talking about the failure of adults, people in power, governments, oil companies, big business to act. Because it's that juxtaposition of those relationships which is powerful. And we're also, just to be clear, that we're not just talking about anxiety. So for us, eco-anxiety really encompasses this range of feelings that we've heard expressed today about grief, rage, sadness, all of these complex feelings. And it's the interplay, it's the interface of these. And they also don't stand still. So it's actually, we've said this so many times today, but we're going to keep saying it. This is an emotionally, mentally healthy response. The children who are expressing these feelings are the mentally healthy ones. I would worry about people that were not feeling these things. We measure mental health by looking at our capacity to respond to external reality, and the external reality is increasingly frightening. So we really need to stand alongside children and young people and tell them the truth, but also validate the wisdom of what it is they're saying. I'm not sorry in the slightest. I'm going to quote another child. I'm going to quote Sophia, I have to use her name. And when I started talking to children about this, I wanted to know how to talk with you about these subjects without frightening you. And I'm going to say what she said. She said, you've got to tell me the truth. She said, because if you don't tell me the truth about climate change, you're lying to me. She said, and if you're lying to me, I can't trust you. And if I can't trust you, I can't tell you how I feel. And if I can't tell you how I feel, I'm on my own with this. And then she said, and anyway, I'm not a baby. Sophia was 8. I kind of think Sophia's summarized it for us perfectly. So I'm going to stop there at that point, give back to Louise, and thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. And yes, we have done many talks together, and it's always wonderful working with you. It's one of my favorite things to do. So just before we get on to some final questions from the audience, I would like to give Jennifer and Louisa and Caroline and Liz all a moment to quickly have any final call to action, snappy sentences which the audience can take away with them. I'm going to start with Jennifer first, and then Louisa, Caroline, and Liz. Take it away, Jennifer.
Sure, thank you, Louise. I mean, making this very swift and snappy the same thing we've been saying for such a long time. Make a plan and stick to that plan, you know, so that when we have the next UN General Assembly, we're just taking stock of how much good we've done, how much action we've taken, rather than always reiterating the problem. You know, it's always about this is what's happening, this is what's going wrong, but we want to talk about solutions, and government needs to make plans and follow through with those plans, divesting, following through on the NDC plans for climate action. Just go with your plan and put your money where your mouth is, really. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. And Louisa?
Yes, I cannot emphasize that enough. The adequate answer to this study is not more petty, not more petting, not more feeling sorry, but the adequate answer is drastic and radical climate action everywhere from all governments worldwide. And just 1 week ahead of the global climate strike, 2 months ahead of the climate conference in Glasgow, it is time. It was time 20 years ago, and it is time now to rise up to this and to prove that the many children worldwide that are feeling doomed will be proven wrong by governments who live up and rise up to this occasion, and to protect present and futures. And if I can just say add one point about being an activist, I think in my understanding, the climate crisis makes everyone an activist, because you know, you either understand and acknowledge the crisis we're in and the mess we're in, and what this means for us in terms of, you know, collective action, or you deny your own power, you deny the crisis, you deny what is around you, you deny the reality, and that is also a lot of energy and a lot of stress and some kind of a burden. So I'm thankful and amazed and inspired to see how many people decide to become a 1.5 activist and not an activist of denial and delaying, because that is kind of the choice we have to make here.
Thank you, Louisa. And Caroline?
Thank you. So I'm going to say a couple of things. I'm going to say psychologically, clinically, we are at risk of damaging trust, relational trust with children and young people intergenerationally if we don't start to take these messages seriously. I would go so far as to say there is a risk, if we don't take action, that we are gaslighting children when, on the one hand, we call a climate emergency, and on the other hand, we fail to act. Those two things are not congruent. Those two things cause psychological distress and cognitive confusion, and we can stop that today. This causes moral injury in children, and this is an emotionally conscience-alive response from them. So this is important. This is not a message of doom and gloom. It is not a message of naive optimism. This is realism that we're talking about today. And we need to hold the tension between those polar opposites. And we need to learn how to do that. Another way of putting it is it's a bleak message of radical hope. And finally, the only cure, not that we need to cure it because climate anxiety is not a mental illness, but if we were attempting to fix it in children and young people, we would absolutely need to be increasing it in government ministers. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. And so now I'm going to pass over to Liz to make any final comments before we get to the last questions. Liz, you're muted, by the way.
Thanks, Eloise. Yes, I would echo everything that's been said, and that climate anxiety is a rational response to an existential threat that we're facing. And the children and young people that completed our survey, that have taken part in research, that are here today, are showing immense courage and I think immense care about other people and the planet, and a wish to make sure that their futures and the futures of the next generations are protected. And we're experiencing here a lack of ethical leadership. And what we really need, as everybody has said, is for governments to take immediate action on climate change in line with climate science. I'd also very much like to acknowledge the co-authors, along with Caroline and Eloise. I'd like to say thank you so much to the co-authors who contributed so much to this research with us. So there's Panu Pikala at the University of Helsinki, there's Susan Clayton at the College of Worcester, the USA, there's Eric Lewandowski at NYU Langone Health in the USA, there's Britt Ray at Stanford University, Catriona Meller, who's at Oxford NHS Foundation Trust, and Louise van Susteren, who's at the Climate Psychiatry Alliance. Thank you, everyone. As well, of course, to the 10,000 young people who took part.
Thank you. So now we're just going to have a few more questions. We're aware we're slightly running over, so we'll do our best to get through them. One very important question that actually quite a few people are asking, and I'm going to direct this to Liz, is they're asking, did they see any differences between the countries, particularly between the global north and global south? And yes, there's been about 3 different questions asking about the sort of different country responses to our questions.
Yeah, well, we are going to publish the complete results, which will include the breakdown on each of these answers for every country. But I think probably most strikingly, across the board, what we saw is levels of anxiety and distressing emotions, negative thoughts about climate change, and feelings of betrayal by governments tended to be higher in the global south than in the global north. However, there were variations country by country. I think the most striking finding perhaps was in that initial slide that I showed, where the levels of functional impairment and high levels of worry were higher in places like the Philippines and India, where they're probably experiencing more of the direct effects of climate-related events already.
Great, thank you. And this question, which question is next? Oh, this question I think is for Caroline. Do you see there being a role for parents in responding to the results of the study and ways they can potentially help if their children are feeling anxiety?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Eloise. I think parents, a lot of parents are already doing a fantastic job of organising themselves to support each other in order to support themselves in supporting their children. So the first thing I would say is parents need to feel the support for themselves. We've been meeting in the recent past with a group of parents, wonderful parents in Bristol, and we used to talk about parenting into the Anthropocene. And this is thinking about parenting slightly differently, that we protect children moving forwards into the climate emergency as things are getting worse by telling them more and not protecting and shielding them from the realities of what we're facing, and to actually support each other and recognizing that that's not traumatizing children or making them anxious or frightening children, but it's supporting children in building the emotional intelligence and resilience that they will need, as do we, in going into this very challenging time. So get the support for yourself, but also have courage in, being a good enough parent might also mean helping your child to prepare for a world that is disrupted, is not always comfortable, and will sometimes often be troublesome. And that's how it's going to be. And we all need to support each other collectively. So do this in community, do this in groups, don't do this on your own.
Thank you, Caroline. And now I have a question for Natasha, so bringing you back in. Someone has asked that you mentioned that it may be possible to sue governments for climate inaction, but is this actually likely to have any concrete enforced impacts on policy?
Thank you. That's a great question. And I think it's really important to underline that the legal arena is, of course, only one and perhaps quite limited arena in which the fight is being fought, right, to avert climate catastrophe. And it's an unwieldy one often. It can be one that comes with delays, with other limitations. Although interestingly, the European Court of Human Rights, for example, in the case I mentioned, is doing its best to expedite the conclusion of this case, even going against a lot of the pushback of the 33 respondent states. the impact of a finding of a human rights violation, of course, depends on how seriously states take their international legal obligations. The finding of a violation of constitutional law, as was the case in Germany, for example, again, really hinges on how seriously states take their legal obligations and how seriously governments take their legal responsibilities. But I believe that it does have significant teeth, and particularly if there's a finding of a violation of an absolute right, which is conclusively unlawful, I think there's a very strong legal imperative there. And that's why I tried to highlight that in my short talk. Of course, speaking law to power, and we've talked about this sheer imbalance of power that we're dealing with here. Speaking law to power has its limits, and it also comes with some problematic framings, like, you know, this casting of children and young people as powerless victims when they're actually showing remarkable resilience and strength and undertaking the most unbelievable initiatives on the local, the national and international plane. It comes with limited remedies sometimes, although I hope that courts will show more courage in their findings as these cases are being fought. But the fight has to continue across the political, all the political platforms that are available, and the legal arena is one that comes with some inherent limitations, which I'm very happy to acknowledge at all times. I don't know if anybody else wants to say something about the litigation as a strategic tool.
Well then, if not, I will pass on to another question.
One thing I might add is, you knew I had to, would be just to think from a psychotherapy point of view, why children are taking these actions. And to not be surprised that if children are not feeling that their voices are being heard, they're not being recognized, validated, respected, then it's not surprising that they're turning to these kind of actions to push adults to take them seriously and to push for the level of change that all of the young people here have been arguing for very clearly today. So I think these legal cases are crucially important, and we shouldn't be surprised if we see them increase.
Thank you for that addition, Caroline. Okay, so for the activists, Louise and Jennifer, someone has asked, how can activists be honest and real without creating despair? That kind of play between facing really difficult truths and also trying to stay motivated and working towards really intense goals. And I'd like to start with Louisa first.
Well, first of all, I would say that there cannot be change without consciousness. So we need to talk about what's out there. We need to, break this climate silence that, large parts of media and governments have kind of created for decades. And so it's important that we look at the crisis, that we acknowledge that it's happening, what is happening, and also what it does to people everywhere, physically and mentally. And I think there's oftentimes this kind of very weird and destructive expectations to activists to always be very hopeful and inspiring and motivated, and to also take activists as this kind of inspiration and motivation token, like, oh well, the young people will fix it. And I think, well, it's not going to be that easy, and I think we shouldn't be fooled into this. We shouldn't be this kind of excuse for everyone not to do something because we are out there and we are so inspiring with what we do. And so I think sometimes it's really important to tell those things that people might not want to hear, and to accept that our messages aren't the inspiring, easy ones, but that they might just be tough and hard to carry because that's what the climate crisis is about. And then I think also, though, there is quite an imbalance we're seeing in many talks about the climate crisis. There's an imbalance at the story we look at. As I mentioned earlier, we are getting better and better in telling the story about the climate crisis, but we're not as good actually in telling the story of change. And it's important to educate everyone about the physical reality out there, but we also need to educate people about change making, about future literacy. So thinking about futures, creating futures, taking the future not as granted or given or lost, but as this, as this big world we need to take into our own hands, and we need to, shift and shape. So I think, it's important to not play along with that very easy and convenient, hopefulness that is being expected from us. But it's also important to not just highlight the physical reality, but also highlight the change that is happening everywhere.
Thank you, Jennifer. No, thank you, Louisa. And now for Jennifer, would you like to add to anything she has said?
Sure, really brilliant contribution, Louisa. And what you said, there's this idea of the burden of hope that's often put on young people. Young people will save the world. You're the generation that needs to make a change. And we're really asking, what exactly do you want us to do when we feel powerless in the face of, something so large and complex to deal with? And, to add to what you said about media balancing the story, there's also something I've sort of worked with, this idea of a wise optimism when we work with the climate crisis, where we have to be really wise as youth activists and be real and, give space to be vulnerable. So in the past 1 year, with all the work that I've done back home, I've also been very open about, my experience of eco-anxiety. And that in itself has ushered a new way for young people to think about their strengths, that the fact that we feel all of these things means we're passionate about a cleaner future, a cleaner air. It ushers us into new ways of thinking about our world. And there's some strength in that. So it's just really knowing how to balance, not to fall into that pit of overwhelm and feeling like a victim in the face of this crisis, but taking steps forward every day, just like the ants, moving one step at a time to say we can make a difference. We can go out to the streets. We can run our advocacy, we can have cleanups, and we can, most importantly, hold our governments accountable. We shouldn't ever feel, ashamed or shy to do all of those things. And that's how we can be real and practical about what we are feeling. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you for everyone for answering those questions. We are going to wrap up for today. If you have any more questions or you've been unable to ask your questions due to the time limit, please email at media@avaaz.org, AVAAZ, and we can answer your question there. Also, you can follow this conversation, because it is not over yet, with us on Twitter using the hashtag #WeFeelThisToo. And I would like to say thank you again to all the speakers, and especially thank you to the audience for giving us your time and letting us tell you our story, and particularly the stories of these young people. And this is not the last from us. We have more research planned, and we're going to be talking about this for a long time. And we hope that you can take away what we've told you, and particularly try and call the people in power, the people in positions, in governments, in positions of power, to listen to their young people, to listen to their youth in all these different countries and hear what they have to say, because it's their responsibility too. So yes, thank you everyone, and hope to talk to you further soon.